In the name of God, Creator, Redeemer, and Sanctifier. Researchers say that about 60% of us make New Year's resolutions, but only about 8% of us are successful in achieving them. Now, regardless of whether we've achieved our resolutions or not, most of us go right ahead and make a new set of them, hoping for the best. So let's guess that about 60% of you here this morning have made some kind of resolution to better yourself in 2019. And we're now about 3 months into the new year, a quarter in, and it's a good time, maybe, to step back and take a quick review. How are you doing? We human beings are fractal creatures. Think of it like a disco ball with all the different mirrors and colors that shoot out when the light hits it. We're made up of a lot of different parts. You might call it our inner family, or call it the community inside ourselves. And if you don't understand what I'm saying, think about that New Year's resolution you made to eat more healthily. I understand that's a very popular one. Maybe you're doing really well with it, and you're off to a good start. But then think about what happens when you walk by your favorite bakery, maybe the Hungarian pastry shop, and you start listening to the chatter within yourself. And if you're listening really carefully, can't you hear those parts inside negotiating with each other? There's a whole cast of characters, maybe like a van full or a bus load. They're arguing, cajoling, negotiating, rationalizing in those moments, those seconds when you either continue walking by or you walk into the bakery. And depending upon which direction you choose, a whole other conversation will follow. In the course of our lives, we suffer loss and pain, trauma. And under the weight of that, our parts can even become extreme, burdened, and polarized. We can have self-rejecting parts that punish those parts of us that are weak and scapegoated. Many of those parts can feel unlovable and exiled. And yes, we have parts that manage well enough under these circumstances, but it can be very much a war-like setting much of the time, an inner war. Not surprisingly, perhaps, we find on the inside, we also find on the outside. And we don't have to look too far outside of ourselves. For many of us these days, it feels like the United States has never been less united. The nation, it seems, has become irrevocably fractured among political and ideological lines. Even just sitting down for Thanksgiving dinner with family has never been more uncomfortable for so many of us. In today's gospel, Jesus presents again as a master teacher of the human soul and its psychology. He is our expert on the evolution of love in the world, not only in our inner landscape, but our outer as well. But I say to you that, listen, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from anyone who takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. In other words, don't do to others as they do to you, Jesus is telling us, but as you would have them do to you. Why on earth would anyone do this? Why? Why? Why, cries my enraged part, at such injustice and passivity, really? Because, as Jesus knows so prophetically, doing unto others as they do to you is the old world system of reciprocity. Evolutionary, it's survival of the fittest, maintaining superiority based on power and violence. Jesus asks us to do as you would have them do to you. Love your enemies. Why? Why? Because they're really nice people after all? Not necessarily. This is the most radical thing in the gospel because it is a departure from the old and an entryway to know the power and mystery of God's love as it is evolving. In his book, The Silence of Jesus, James Breach writes that Jesus is the most loving and least sentimental man one could imagine. Love your enemies is not sentimentality. This is something that goes right to the heart of it. Jesus says, do good to those who hate you and bless those who curse you and pray for those who abuse you. And watch what happens. That's key. This is a recipe for destroying the little bundle of lies about myself and my society that came into existence the moment my tribe and I found somebody to hate. What Jesus is teaching here is what Father Thomas Keating calls ultra charity, which would be the opposite and antidote to ultra violence. And following this injunction to love your enemy, it's not just a nice thing to do. It's a matter of destroying the whole system of mystification, which has been the womb in which you and I have lived and moved and had our social existence. This is what we've learned. It is a recipe for deconstructing that whole business. And we have to recognize the intensity and the wisdom of that. Jesus offers the way wherein love becomes the healing agent, or you might say a wrench in the spokes of this way of being in the world that we can't seem to shake. Before his death in October, Father Thomas Keating, a principal in the reemergence of the contemplative prayer movement, he wrote an article about the rise of violence in the world. And he said that a new horror has appeared on the horizon. that instead of a world community committed to the preservation and betterment of life, the threat of increasing violence looms ever larger. And he names this new horror as humanicide. Humanicide, because it involves the possible extinction of the human race. If you consider the Trump administration's recent announcement to suspend the 1987 landmark weapons treaty known as the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which then has the potential to incite a new arms race, not only with Russia, but with other countries developing nuclear weapons, well, Father Thomas Keating's concerns are not without merit. Humanicide. And Keating asks us this question. He asks us to reflect on it. Can the use of weapons of mass destruction be morally justified even for the purpose of self-defense? And then he adds that this just war theory of the Middle Ages is no longer applicable given our ability to destroy life on a global scale. Instead, Father Keating proposes an alternative. And it is to the commitment to the practice of charity. In the Hebrew language, the term for charity is hesed, love that is boundless and everlasting. In Greek, it's agape, love that is totally selfless. In Latin, caritas, unconditional love. In English, charity is the limitless compassion for suffering at every level of human experience. Charity, then, is another word for the practice of nonviolence. It is to continue loving despite opposition or persecution. To love your neighbor as yourself is the language of the Hebrew Scriptures. To love one another as I have loved you is the language of Jesus. Now, admittedly, charity as a way of life has never been tried on a national, let alone a worldwide scale. And it may not be enough to heal the enormous proportions of the present crisis of our civilization. However, as Jesus is teaching us today, the only fully adequate alternative to utmost violence is utmost charity, the practice of mutual love in personal relationships and among nations. Where to begin? Perhaps most important, we need a way to infuse our national discourse with that kind of ultra charity that Father Keating exemplified in his life. No matter what identity we claim, we can each start to make the change our country needs by making ourselves into agents of transformation and healing in our neighborhoods and our communities. And the wholeness that we hunger to see in our country, we must also apply to ourselves. It may be that the most radical act of love's evolution would be to offer ourselves ultra charity, to bring all of our inner parts home with a loving embrace. I believe Christ's radical notion of love may even heal those enemies within us. It can be practiced. Jesus says we have to love and recognize the divine image in ourselves, our neighbor, and even our enemies. He teaches what many think a leader could never, ever demand of his followers. And from an ego perspective, it makes no sense. But soulfully, it makes absolute sense. Because in terms of the development of the soul, of full personhood, it really is all or nothing. And it is at the cutting edge of consciousness, seeing ourselves as God sees us. Either we see the divine image in all created things, or we don't see at all.